Hey everybody, CVH here, and today we'll be continuing with part 2 of our Essential Epics in Elder Scrolls Legends Crafting Guide. Today we'll be continuing with the Agility cards, the Endurance cards, the Dual Color cards, the Class-specific cards, and the neutral cards in Legends. If you missed part 1, you're just stumbling in now, feel free to check that out. I'll make sure it's linked at the end of the video if you haven't seen part 1 where we go over the Strength, Intelligence, and Willpower epics. If you missed part 1, basically what we're doing is first going through the 1 to 4 cards essentially in every color that I would say are required, that you really want to pick up and will allow you to play the widest variety of decks in Legends that are high tier and optimized based on power level and how often these are seen. And then I'll be going through and rating all of the other epics that you'll see in each color and giving them sort of like an A, B, C, D, E rating, depending on whether or not they're a little bit gimmicky, whether or not they just don't see much play, whether or not there are better options, or just if they are not really a priority. Basically, the ones I'm talking about first, if you go through the list of all the ones that I talked about first in every color, and you wind up having all of those cards, it should allow you to build a really wide variety of decks from aggro, mid-range, and control in Legends, because they just see so much play and they're just so required for these decks. So without further ado, let's get things started with Agility. And the first card I'm going to be talking about in Agility is none other than Leaf Lurker. Leaf Lurker is just a damn good card. This is a huge tempo swing in conjunction with cards that can easily allow you to proc its ability. Therefore, wounding an enemy creature, you need something like a Rapid Shot, a Curse with the Goblin Skulk package, Skaven Pyromancer even, and things just naturally get damaged when they're trading. You know, creature combat damages creatures. Imagine that. So Leaf Lurker by itself is never really going to need a combo to be good, but when you can combo it with a card like a Curse, as many of the Archer decks and Assassin decks currently do, Leaf Lurker goes from good to insanity. The card is just really good on 5 by itself a lot of the time, even without one of those abilities though, and you'll see it in mid-range decks, you'll see it in certain control decks, although recent control monk lists have not included it. You'll see it in a lot of Ram Scout lists depending on the list. It's not really required in those decks, but for many of the mid-range decks and tempo decks that really focus on those large tempo swings from plays, this is one of the best ways to keep the board clear while adding to your board. So I really encourage you, if you want to play decks with green, pick up Leaf Lurker. It wouldn't really be bad in any of them, I would say. It's just definitely required in a lot of them. The other epic I want to mention in Agility is actually from the Fall of the Dark Brotherhood expansion, so as always with these cards, if you've gotten the expansion, you don't need to worry about crafting them. You will be getting all the cards through playing through the story mode if you've gotten the Fall of the Dark Brotherhood. Eclipse Baroness is really crazy for slower decks. There are mid-range Assassin decks that want to go a bit later with Eclipse Baroness and Atromancer currently that really put the hurt on a lot of control strategies because this card just oozes value. I made 3 premium copies of this card the day I got the Fall of the Dark Brotherhood. Just spent all those soul gems because I knew it was going to be that good in slower decks, and it hasn't disappointed. You'll see it in virtually every control monk, virtually every Ram Scout, and, you know, like I mentioned, even the slower Assassin decks and some slower Archer decks as well. If you're going in the late game and you want to win the value game, as in card advantage and just, you know, hard to deal with cards that are just going to give you more cards that are hard to deal with, this card is the card for you. Just compare it, like, if you get Piercing Javelin, let's say, yeah, they're 5 cost removal, 8 your 8 drop, which is not great for tempo, but for the value game, you lost a card, they lost a card, you gained 2 cards, and they were reduced by 2 magicka, which increases the efficiency of your future plays and probably gets you the tempo back if the game is going long enough. The reduction can be crazy good, and just the value in general. It's a +2 if you're getting 1 for 1. Sometimes this card even trades favorably a couple times. It's just crazy in the late game. Getting this card Marocked kind of sucks in a control mirror match, I will say that. But it's something you should look for with your Marocks to steal Eclipse Baroness. It'll win you the value game pretty much by itself. Card's really good, and if you're going to play slow green decks, you really want this card. So now let's go through and rate the ones that I didn't think were necessarily worth an A+ rating. Oops, went too far. Leaf Water Blessing, you don't need to worry about. Gets an E from me. Good in some meme strategies that, you know, gain health. Maybe I've seen it maybe once or twice, but it's just not very good. Don't worry about it in any top tier deck currently. Mournhold Trader. Now, this is a very good card, especially if you have ways to protect it from cards like Fighter's Guild Recruit and Sanctuary Pet, like Shadow Shift and Wordcrafter. If you're playing those cards, this card can be seen in a lot of really aggressive Archer and Assassin lists because it is like the biggest 2-drop you can play. If you ring this out on turn 1, It's actually one of the best openers in the game. It requires an immediate answer. I didn't put this as tier 1 on my epic list in this video because it's not required in any list, but in some decks it is the best 2-drop you can play and the ideal thing to have on turn 1 or turn 2. Depends on the card choices, keep that in mind. Take a look at some builds out there, see which ones include traders, see which ones don't. But for some archer lists and some assassin decks in particular, you will really want Mournhold traders in the list. That said, you can function with other 2-drops like Daring Cutpurse and Goblin Skulk, but some really want the trader. So not a bad card to have your hands on, really pushes a ton of damage early. If that's what your deck's about, Mournhold Trader does it better than virtually any other 2-drop in the game. Swindler looks better than it is. I've seen some newer players think of playing this card to combat some decks like when Item Source was really popular, but it's just not very good. It's not going to give you the bonus of the items, it's just going to give you the stats and take stats away, which doesn't accomplish the purpose you want it to. Looks like a better tech card than it is, it's actually just pretty horrendous. And never really good by itself on curve, obviously 3-drop 2/2, not where any constructed deck wants to be. Kinsman is going to get a B- from me. This card used to be an A. It used to be a 3/3. Last Gasp effect is really powerful. It's going to be racing your opponent by putting them on a clock and healing you somewhat. This card, when it was a 3/3, used to be a staple in every deck that ran green except for the very slowest, because sometimes the damage it dealt to your opponent was a liability, giving them extra cards off of rune destruction. However, it's still pretty good in some really aggressive green decks. You will frequently see this card in very aggressive decks that use the color. It's just not required in many decks anymore, and since it's a 3/2 and trades less efficiently, for those decks that want to take over the board early, it doesn't really do it super well. So a lot of decks have taken this card out, but it gets a B-. If you have them, certain decks can really make use of them. Hidden Trail, another kind of meme card. It's just not required in any deck. It's not as good as Divine Fervor, not as good as Thieves Den. Tried it in a few aggro decks. It's playable, but it's a D- overall for me. Moonlight Werebat's interesting because it does see a fair bit of play still. Like Kinsman, it was nerfed from 3 health to 2 health a few months back, and then of course it was an A+. This might have been one of the best cards in the game. It was easily the best prophecy in the game to get early against an aggro deck. Still pretty good against that same type of deck in that same type of situation. Just that much worse now from your hand. And like I mentioned, there are new healing effects in the game, so if you're playing a control deck, you really don't need this card. There are just more efficient, consistent ways to heal, and you're often just wasting turn 4 by playing it into a Firebolt. Doesn't contest boards super well, just okay off of Prophecy. Some aggressive decks can play it, maybe a mid-range archer list might occasionally play the card, but even there, it's being taken out more often than not. If mid-range, Prophecy Assassin comes back into seeing play, you'll notice that certain decks like that will want to play it because it's a very specific card that can help you off of a swingy Prophecy. Just the idea of packing your deck full of Prophecies might make this worth it, but as with Loyal Housecarl, I guess, while it's a good Prophecy, it's just not really worth the deck space too much anymore. This card was in fact nerfed, a little bit out of commission. Murkwater Shaman's actually really good as well. This card also gets a B from me, maybe even a B+. Certain decks really want it. I noticed this card saw a lot of play when I first started in August and September, dropped out completely for a while, and it's kind of back in style now. People are realizing how good the curse is. The zero-cost curse, of course, that gives -1/-1. People are playing Goblin Skulks, Murkwater Shamans, taking advantage of them with Leaf Lurker, and just taking advantage of them in general because -1/-1 is good against a lot of early game creatures and can really help you take control of the board. If you're using this card against an aggressive opponent, they're really going to have to find a way to deal with it immediately, which is not impossible, but if they can't, it might just win the game from there. Really powerful card. Depending on the list, if you want to take advantage of those curse effects, some of the decks that aren't focusing too much on aggression but really focusing on board control, a lot of assassin lists are currently using it, a lot of archer lists are currently using it. Check out what lists are using it and see if you want to pick it up. Very good card though, it doesn't hurt to have these in your collection, giving it a B for me. Or maybe a B+, whatever I said. Murkwater Skirmisher, however, is a little bit different. If you want to play a goblin-centric deck, this is obviously required. It's kind of the only reason you would want to do so. It's a very powerful card in that deck, so in that deck it's like a pretty easy A- or something like that. Maybe even an A+. It's just a really good card. It allows the deck to be a thing, but the fact of the matter is the deck still isn't really a thing, and not a card I'd go out of your way if you're trying to build a well-rounded collection that can build a bunch of other decks, unless you just really want to build goblins, in which case, yeah, get Skirmisher, but overall it's not very good because goblins simply don't have that much support yet, but in the future, if they do, this card could be like Wood or Cannoner level, where you just want this card if you're playing that deck, and it is a good deck, but right now it's not even that good of a deck. Kenmar Swiftclaw is another card that could potentially be very good in a Pilfer deck, given the right combinations of cards like Master of Thieves and Thieves Den, because this card, anything that gives extra attacks, this card could just get out of hand really, really quickly. The issue is if you don't have the right setup, it's very easy to kill, fireboltable, executable. We talked about that with Breton Conjure, that, if they have that 1-cost removal or something for your 4-cost, you might just lose the game. That said, if you do have the right combo, this card can get out of hand crazy hard. The issue is the combos are a bit harder to pull off than simply rapid shotting your Breton Conjure, so I don't really think this card is very good, but if the right combo potential is realized in Pilfer Monk, it can be really solid. So I'll give it like a D+. In the absolute right specific deck, it might be worth a slot, but don't expect to get consistent value out of the card. Moving on to the next page, we have Torvald Crook. Again, can be pretty good in the Pilfer-oriented deck. If you have Master of Thieves out, you can maybe attack twice and get that additional Magicka. I've seen some combo decks focused around Elsewhere. Look out. Torvald Crook, Master of Thieves, Thieves Den, Tenmar Swiftclaw. The issue with all of these cards that I just mentioned is that they're all, except for Master of Thieves really, they're all just bad by themselves. So that's a risk you make. A risk you take when you play that kind of deck. Very combo-oriented, and Torvald Crook, again, for Pilfer Monk even, it's not required in Pilfer Monk. Most Pilfer Monk decks that I've seen do not play this card because it's just not very good by itself. And, it's a theme of Pilfer creatures that they're not super good stat-wise, but this card just takes that to the extreme. It's horrible stat-wise. That said, in certain combo decks you can maybe see it, but I'll give it like a D-. Cameron Scout Leader is going to get another E from me. You just don't see this card at all. To take advantage of damaged creatures, basically you want to play Leaf Lurker and the occasional finish off. Scout Leader is just never really worth it. There are better ways to go wide on the board. There are better 5-drops all over the place. You can find them, and you just never see this card in Constructed. Don't worry about it. Elder Centaur, kind of the same thing. The effect looks crazy. Cover is really, really good. But so is Lightning Bolt and so is Piercing Javelin. Don't worry about this card at all. Next card is going to be Giant Snake, which is actually pretty damn good. I've crafted this card premium for a good reason. It sees play in virtually every Ramp Scout list currently that I've seen. That deck has sort of fallen off in popularity, but for a very specific type of slow green deck, this card is crazy because it's one of the only ways it has to really fight that aggression by locking down an entire lane. You don't need this card too much in more aggressive decks, although much like we mentioned with Winter's Grasp, you could potentially see it as a 1 or 2 of in some of these decks, simply as a way to race. You're dealing a lot of damage, your opponent's trying to race in the same lane or trade, or they're developing threats in the shadow lane to try to push your life total down. Use Giant Snake, and that could be a serious problem for them. Not required in any deck really, except for Ram Scout currently, but a good card that could see more time in the limelight again in the future if popularity rises of this card. I could see it in virtually any green deck as a tech card. It's not really bad in any deck, it's just not required in any deck except for Ram Scout, for which it fills a really unique role and stalls better than most cards in the game. Green Touch Spriggan is next, and while it's sort of a meme card if you're playing a deck with a bunch of heal, I've seen more people try that with the new Protector of the main card. The deck's still just too gimmicky. Don't recommend picking this up. Not going to be very good for you in general. Leaf Lurker already talked about. Pomerot Renegade gets a B for me. It's a solid 5-drop. The issue is, like Child of Hercene basically, you see this card a lot in mid-range decks that want to take advantage of Unstoppable Rage, and besides that, there are just slightly better 5-drops out there. The effect is good. It's not really as good as Blood Dragon, and maybe not even as good as Snowy Sabercat by itself if you don't have Unstoppable Rage, which is another card that's going to get like a B, maybe a B-. Extra attacks are good. The stats are durable, not necessarily great. It's not going to push a lot of damage. You're pushing 1 more point of damage than you would with a Blood Dragon if you're attacked twice with Sabercat. The cool thing about this card is that you can suit it up with an item, and if you suit it up with an item in the right deck, it can be pretty crazy, but it's like kind of not worth it. A lot of decks don't really want to play items, like, what are you thinking, like Assassin or Archer with a bunch of items for the Sabercat. It's good with a Snake Tooth Necklace, but again, in order to really make it worth it, you have to buff it up further, and that's just kind of unrealistic. But a fine, durable card, and when I say these cards are like durable, I mean you'll probably see these cards a lot in Arena because they're pretty good 5-drops in Arena. Smuggler's Hall it's not really a meme card. It's really good with Swindler's Market decks because of all the 0-cost cards. Outside of that, I don't recommend this card in basically any deck. It's good with Swindler's Market. That's basically it. You don't need to worry about getting this card because you will have to craft it. It is a monthly reward card from a long time ago, and it's really only seen consistent play since then in Swindler's Market decks, and that's basically it. And even for Swindler's Archer, you don't normally see this card because you just don't need additional 0-cost cards besides the Nord Firebrands and those generators. Beastcaller is interesting because it is a solid card, if not one that's a little too RNG dependent. I've seen this card before in some control monk lists that want to make a more mid-range strategy happen against other slow decks, and some mid-range archer lists. The issue is consistency. I don't think it's particularly correct in those decks currently, but you will see it occasionally if you want to have more of those the mid-range threat-oriented game plans against slower decks. I'll give it a solid C. It's not a bad card, it's just probably not worth it in most decks, but it can be decent filler if you're playing a green deck. Spider Lair. There are decks dedicated to Spider Lair that just stall the game out indefinitely. By itself, though, I have to be honest and say this card is pretty awful. Gonna give it a D. Sorry, guys. It just gets removed by Shadowfen Priest, gets removed by Belligerent Giant, and the effect is not high impact at all. So while you can build a deck based around stalling and getting value out of Spider Lair, you're better just getting value out of better cards like Eclipse Baroness. That's a better card. Chorus Breeding Pit, monthly reward card. Again, it's fine, you don't need it for any deck though. I have tested it in slower decks, it's reasonable, it's sometimes fun, it's sometimes pretty good, but it's not actually good enough to worry about, I don't think. So if you miss that card in a monthly reward card, don't worry about it too much, but you will need to worry about some cards in Endurance, which is next. Endurance has a few really good epics that you will want to pick up for certain styles of decks, the first of which I'm going to talk about is Preserver of the Root. Kind of a staple of slower decks. 4-drop 6/6 with guard is just really powerful, really efficient in the late game and in the early game. You can use it as a relatively decent beater. 4-drop 4/4 is not the absolute worst. It's like a Sage without an effect, and if it happens to survive without getting silenced or removed, you will eventually have a 6/6 with guard, which is pretty good. It can be an aggressive beat stick for some mid-range decks, and it's a really powerful staple in control decks and ramp decks. Shadowfen Priest is in the running for one of the best cards in the game simply due to versatility. This is one of those cards that makes cards like Spider Lair and Mundus Stone pretty bad sometimes. The support removal is just super good for decks that want to focus on that, and just 5-drop 4/4 silence anything on the board, that's already good. It's a reasonably sized body that doesn't punish you too much for just having it in your hand or silencing something that's not an insane silence target, and when you get crazy value out of silence, it can feel really unfun. Very good card for slower decks. Some super aggressive warrior decks don't want to play this card. They want to use Earthbone Spinner, or even another way to bypass guards because it's 5 cost, which is a little bit slow, but 95% of decks using Endurance will be playing Shadowfen Priest, and for good reason. So I don't think there's anything up here that I need to talk about. I'll mention Night Shadow in the slightly lower tier of epics that we'll talk about. Hissgrove, however, I will mention just because 100% required for ramp decks. This is the reason you really want to focus on ramping in particular. This is the ramp win condition. Whereas Manticore helps control exist, Hissgrove helps ramp decks exist, because, ramping is fine. There are no ramp cards in this game that are particularly that good by themselves. Hissgrove is the card that really incentivizes you to make your max magic go up above 12, and if you get 15 with this card on the board for a turn, it spawns an 8/8 in each lane. This card used to be crazy because you could play it and you didn't have to wait a turn. It didn't have that whole at the start of your turn little text right there. While it got significantly worse and more counterable, it did make it more interactive and fair. So yeah, Hissgrove's still really good for ramp decks. It's kind of the reason you would build one. I don't recommend playing a whole lot of ramp cards without Hissgrove, but yeah, if you want to play ramp, you have to pick up 3 of these cards. Sorry, it's from a while ago if you didn't play that game. If you didn't play the game during that time, you will have to pick up 3 of these to play like a ramp scout or a ramp spell sword in particular. Ramp scout is like the one class that really requires the ramp strategy, because Thornhist Mage is just so good. You could play control spell sword without ramp pretty effectively. Moving on to the slightly lower tier of epics. Illyxor Sir, I'm going to give it a B. It's a fine 1-drop. You just don't always need it in a lot of decks. It's not the ideal 1-drop for every single deck. It's really good if you can buff it up, because if you can buff it up, let's say you Tome of Alteration it into a 3/3, it loses ward after that, it will become a 6/3. That's pretty good. It doubles the power, not the health. It's fine. It is counterable by Curse and stuff like that, which can be pretty painful. Counterable by Earthbone Spinner, that's a pretty big problem for the card. Without that, it might be a little bit too good. It's like Argent Squire with an upside for those Hearthstone players coming to Legends now. Pretty good card, not really required for any deck, however. Siege Catapult, this card looks a lot better than it is, because you might see it's being good in like a token spell sword strategy, but for every time it's good, there's another time when it's just dead in your hand. It's a horrible top deck when you're losing the board. Granted, the whole deck isn't that good when you're losing the board, but besides that one specific deck, no deck wants it really at all. It is meme worthy in like a silent scout deck with suppresses, Curse Specters, Shadowfen Priests, and like imprisoned Deathlords, because 2-drop 5/5 when it's silenced, that's a beat stick. 4-drop 7/7, that's a beat stick, but the downsides of these cards are just too heavy to really worry about in a traditional good deck. Now, I believe Kingpin used to be better than it is. It used to be, I think, a 2/2 or maybe a 1/2. I don't know. Either way, it was a lot better than it is currently in like closed beta. But as long as I've been playing the game, the card has been pretty trashed here. I mean, don't get me wrong, Warrior Orcs is a good deck. It's just a matter of this card not being particularly good in that deck. It's a really bad 2-drop on curve, requires a lot of things to go right for it to live long enough to actually be worth it. I would rather play 2-drop 3-2, honestly. And again, this card is super weak to Earthbone Spinner, and cards like it, like Execute, Firebolt, all that good stuff. Black Rose Herbalist, it's another 3-drop 2-4 with no upside to really speak of. It's sometimes mediocre in Arena, really bad and constructed. Hackwing Feather, it's sometimes mediocre in Arena, not really anything to talk about in constructed. You don't see these cards seeing any constructed play. Necromancer's Amulet can be in those really slow decks with Spider Lair. We've already, basically everything I said about Spider Lair applies to this card as well. It's kind of gimmicky, it's kind of really fun to win with if you like 30-minute games, and yes, they sometimes go that long, but in reality, it's not a super great style of deck, and it loses really hard to support removal as you might expect. Angry Grawl is kind of okay as a functioning 4-drop. I don't think it's the optimal 4-drop in any mid-range deck, but if you are missing cards, this is one that can get the job done. A 4-drop 4/6 with Regenerate is really powerful. The issue is the inconsistencies. Again, if you play a 4-drop 2/4, you're feeling really bad about yourself. It's worse than Black Rose Herbalist at that point. Grim Champion, you don't see this card anywhere. It's just not very good, too inconsistent, kind of gimmicky. I don't think I've actually ever seen Grim Champion in constructed now that I'm thinking about it. I have seen Imprisoned Deathlord in the same deck we discussed with the Siege Catapult, the Silence deck with a bunch of suppresses and stuff. This isn't really a meta deck, I don't want to give that impression, but if you're playing that kind of meme deck, it's good. In any other deck in the game, Imprisoned Deathlord sucks. You just really don't want to play this card. It will get shackled every turn. You can use it with silences though. Lionguard Strategist, okay in Arena because it snowballs. In constructed, the ability's good, the stats are just too much of a hindrance to the card. It gets executed, and that in itself is a pretty big problem. Crushing Blow, Lightning Bolt, all the removal that you would normally expect, and just the tempo loss on curve because you have to just wait to get value out of the effect, and even Ward is not particularly good when you're getting beaten down. So the card is just too slow to see play. Gets punished way too hard by control decks with the removal, and aggressive decks with them just killing you before it gets too much value. Disciple of Namira, it's more expensive Cultmaster for the Hearthstone players. Turns out that's not very good in this game. I have not seen a whole lot of this card. There is a Token Warrior deck that has seen some play in the past. It's pretty good in there. You can use it with the Nord Firebrand tokens. Besides that, not very good. Not a card you need to worry about picking up. Basically, I'll give it like a D. Stampeding Mammoth, reasonable in Arena, reasonable body. Gets a C-. You just don't need it in any deck. There's no deck that this card is the optimal 5-drop. And when you want more than one 5-drop, it doesn't have utility. It's just there, it's a body, it died, hooray, it doesn't push a whole lot of damage if it manages to survive, it's just not very good. Flesh Atronach you can play, again, you'll see this in the really, really slow deck, maybe with Necromancer's Amulet and Spider Lair, but this is probably the most feel-bad Earthbone Spinner target in the world. Yeah, that's pretty much all I need to say about it. That's the reason it doesn't see play in high-tier decks, and likely never will see play in high-tier decks. It doesn't matter how big your 6-drop is, if it gets Piercing Javelin, Belligerent Gianted, Earthbone Spinnered, and doesn't impact the board immediately. Similarly, a lot of Endurance cards are like this. There's a few really good ones, and a lot of just really kind of mediocre ones that you might play in Arena, like Flesh Atronach and Mammoth and Night Predator even, which is the next one. Really sick premium, looks better than it is. Don't be fooled, Breakthrough and Regenerate simply aren't that good. You're paying 6 for a 5/6 that's not impacting the board immediately, and it's not putting enough pressure on your opponent. Don't play this card on any constructed deck, really. Keeping the premium in hopes that they allow me to play my premiums in Arena one day, because that would be pretty sick, and it is relatively okay in Arena. Night Shadow is actually pretty good. I'm going to give this card a B. It suffers from the exact same problem as the last 4 cards we mentioned, which is it's really easy to answer and slow, but the difference is when this card sticks, it's actually worth it. This card can help you race if you're using this near the top end of your mid-range deck. The drain is really powerful, and this card got a lot better because of Unstoppable Rage. That's actually a 2-card combo that's really worth it a lot of the time. Like I mentioned, currently, Rage works really well with Breakthrough and Drain. This card has both. It's actually just the best Rage target in the game, I think, pushing the damage, draining you for a lot. And it's not super easy to kill. It's not lightning boltable. The issue is it costs 6, so Piercing Javelin is a threat, Belligerent Giant's a threat, Leaf Lurker is a threat. I don't need to tell you why this card isn't broken. There are too many answers to it immediately, but if it sticks, it is actually good, unlike a lot of the other cards we mentioned, which just aren't that good or consistently good. Gravesinger. Now, if this card sticks, it can be nuts. The issue is that it costs 10, so it's going to be like all the answers we just mentioned, in addition to Manticore and Mirok, which are game losing. So you're only really going to go to the late game against decks that don't kill you early, like control decks, and against those decks they have too many answers. It's from Dark Brotherhood, so if you have that expansion, you have it, but definitely don't worry about getting the expansion for Gravesinger. It's just not really good and constructed, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. Moving on to the multicolored cards, the class-specific cards, and as with legendaries, there are going to be a lot of the ones here that are going to see a lot of play. The power level of these cards is relatively high compared to the normal single attribute cards, as you might expect. As I did with the class-specific legendaries, I'll be going through every single one of these cards in order, because most of them are going to be constructed playable, and just briefly talking about why you want to play this card in which decks, and exactly how ubiquitous they are. Some of these are seen in every single deck of their color, or of their color combination, the class, and some of them are seen in only some, and a couple of them just don't see much constructed play, period, and I'll discuss briefly why. Sentinel Battle Mace. Virtually every Battle Mage deck plays this. Battle Mage is tilted towards aggression. You will see this is the 3 of in every single aggro Battle Mage list. Adds resilience to the board, adds, with the word I mean, and adds 4 attack to the board as well. Helps you trade well, helps you face well. It's just a really good card. Merrick Battle Mage will frequently run at least 2, sometimes 3. I don't expect this card to not see play in any Battle Mage deck. You will probably see this card. Really good to pick up if you want to play Battle Mage. Rift Thane, one of the better 2-drops in the game. The versatility of this card is actually really good. Sometimes you want your opponent to hit you for like 1 or 2 points early, because a 2-drop 2/4 guard is just wildly efficient against other aggressive decks. Every Crusader list that I've ever seen is playing 3 of these, and I don't really expect that to change anytime soon. Fallen SD Reaver is actually the one I was thinking of that doesn't see hardly any play anymore. Really slow Archer decks wanted to use this card for the value a long time ago with like Skaven Pyromancer, but that's so inefficient, and now that we have Unstoppable Rage, if you wanted to play a slower Archer deck that has good board clears, that's the way to do it. Fallen SD Reaver just a little too inconsistent, and you probably don't want to play this card. As sad as it is to see a class-specific card not see play, that's what we have with the Reaver here. Militant Chieftain is interesting because it's like an Orc card. It's exactly like Wood Orc Headhunter, except it's also a warrior-specific card, so if you're playing exactly a warrior Orc deck, you want and probably need 3 Militant Chieftains. If you're playing any non-warrior deck, obviously you can't play it, and if your warrior deck is not an Orc tribal synergy deck, you do not care about Militant Chieftain whatsoever because it's just simply not worth it. But in those decks, it's really good and one of the most powerful cards in the deck, actually. Very good at keeping your pressure alive. Very good at adding a lot of power to the board. It's like Divine Fervor plus, say, I don't know, whatever card gets a creature back from your discard pile to your hand. Kind of this one, basically. It's a very unique card, basically. You want this card in Orcs, don't want it anywhere else. And as you'll see, we actually have one of the monthly reward cards was Warrior, so there's 2 Warrior class-specific cards currently. Sower of Revenge. Now, this is a Warrior card that I'm pretty sure currently, as of when I'm recording this video, you just want to play 3 of these in every single Warrior deck. It's like Battle Mace, except I'm pretty sure I just play 3 of them in every single Warrior deck. This card is so good in an aggro deck. It helps you race your opponent so well, because you're getting the 5 power on the board. Your opponent has to interact with it if they don't want you to kill them with it, and sometimes you're forcing them to interact with it when they want to just shackle it, because it's a guard that might block your opponent's lane if they're also an aggressive strategy. That 5 damage, like if you can attack with this card to deal 5, then they have to waste resources or creatures to kill it and it deals another 5. This is in the running for one of the most objectively powerful cards in the game, and even as a control player it might look pretty bad because, as we mentioned with House Kinsman, sometimes the direct damage to your opponent's a liability, but when you're playing that defensive game, a 5-drop 5/5 guard in Warrior really isn't bad. It's one of the better defensive tools you have access to. It applies a lot of blockage to the board if there's a specific lane that's troubling you. And when you're in those control versus control matchups, you'll be really happy you have Sower of Revenge in your deck. Not only is it a pretty hard body to deal with, but when you're trying to turn up the pressure and finally end the game, Sower of Revenge helps you do that better than most cards. So I really think it's unfortunate if you play Warrior and you missed this monthly reward card. I'm sorry, you guys, you just have to make 3 Sower of Revenge if you want to play Warrior and you don't have this card already. It's just that good. Probably one of the highest priority crafts if you really want to play Warrior, because, again, since it's a monthly reward card, currently you can't pull it. Maybe they'll do some sort of bundle in the future where you can get your hands on these monthly reward cards, but this one, probably the best monthly reward card they've released so far, in all honesty. Just a super powerful card. Skywatch Vindicator looks better than it is. It is a high utility card. The issue is it's not high utility enough to really see play in a lot of control decks. More aggressive mage decks can frequently make use of it, but I'll give this card like Fallen SD Reaver plus. if that's a ranking. I don't know exactly what rank to give it. It's better than Fallen SC Reaver, worse than like all the others basically, just because you don't need it in anything. Objectively, it is better than Reaver because you're more likely to get full value out of the effect. The full value just isn't that swingy, just isn't that required. But it is a pretty decent card for like a mid-range mage deck. If you have one of these and you're missing some cards, sure, jam it. It's not bad, it's just not great. Satyrs Agent is another card that's not bad, but it's not great. The issue is the low health, obviously, but there are certain decks that really want this card. Any sort of aggressive assassin deck when you're in a meta with other aggressive decks, it's probably sometimes better than the Deshaan Avenger, but it is a worse Deshaan Avenger more often than not, because the reason you're playing these cards is the stickiness against control, and it just gives you a 2-1 with guard, and you can't really race with it. You can't stick it in the shadow lane because it has guard. I mean, you can stick it in the shadow lane defensively, but you can't expect it to live a turn, basically, almost ever, and it is pretty fragile. Decent card, not required for any assassin deck, I would say. Yeah, even the last gasp decks frequently don't need this card. You have Deshaan Avenger for that. Decent card, not required. Shornhelm Champion, while it's not required, it is really good at mid-range Sorcerer. Currently, I would give this card, I mean, it's not as good as Sower or Battle Mace. You will see some decks not include it. This card doesn't impact the board immediately, and 5 cost, can get Cursed Leaf Lurkered, can get Belligerent Gianted, can get Silenced. It's a pretty good silence target, but this card is really hard to deal with for control decks. And, especially control decks that don't have access to, an on-hand piercing javelin. It's like, how else do you really organically get through this? You can't trade with the ward, then lightning bolt it. It can get pretty large really quickly, especially if you reward it. It has some really cute synergy, but often it's just used as a pretty good 5-cost card that's hard to deal with and pushes damage. No problems with Shornhelm. I expect it to continue to see play in just basic mid-range curve-out sorcerer decks for a long time to come. Master of Thieves, so this is interesting too. It's kind of the warrior effect, where if you're playing a monk deck with Pilfer Synergy, you want Master of Thieves, and any other deck you don't need it, but in that specific deck you really need it. Pilfer is currently worse than Orc Warrior, so you need this card less than you need Militant Chieftain, but it's still really good in that deck. So if you want to play Pilfer Monk, pick up Master of Thieves. The deck simply will not be good without it. Protector of the Main is kind of the Sower of Revenge of Monk. They gave us a monthly card that seems to be pretty good throughout in Monk decks. I've tested it in Control. I know many people have tested it in more mid-range decks that do make use of Dawnstar Healer, which we talked about in the part 1 of this series. And it seems pretty good. People have told me it's very good in those styles of decks. It is the newest card in the game right now because it may, for us, June just started, so we just got this card. But it has lived up to some of the hype, and if you're going to play monk decks, I think it's probably worth picking up a playset of these. I think it's overall reasonable in all styles of decks, not of the same power level as Sower, at least from what I can tell yet. Didn't really impact things in the same way, but a very good card. Next on the list is Edict of Azura, and Edict of Azura is a crazy card. Just one of the best pieces of removal in the game, if not the best. Piercing Javelin for 1 less Magicka, with the ability to destroy supports from your hand. As a prophecy, obviously it's not a prophecy, so it's not as good as Javelin there, but the versatility of this card, this is about as good as a standalone piece of targeted removal will ever be in Legends from your hand. The issue is, of course, you have to play Spellsword in order to play this card, but I'm pretty sure every single Spellsword deck wants it. This is kind of one of the best reasons to play Spellsword Control, honestly. Strictly better Piercing Javelin from your hand, good support removal. Playing a support-centric deck against Spellsword with Edict of Azura's and Shadow and Priest removal can feel pretty awful. And Edict of Azura, the versatility of this card, it's not adding anything to the board. I mean, but this is one of the best actions in the game, just period. I don't really know what to say about this card. It's very simple. If you're playing Spellsword, you really want to play Edict of Azura, more than likely. I can't really think of a reason you wouldn't want to play it unless you're playing a very aggro Spellsword deck. Those aren't really a thing right now, maybe in the future, but right now I'm pretty sure every Spellsword deck wants Edict of Azura. Just a really, really powerful card. Thornhist Mage, again, I think every Scout deck wants this. Most of the Scout decks you'll see are of the ramp variety, so that helps. It's the best ramp card in the game, objectively. While Histgrove gives you a reason to ramp, Thornhist Mage is just the best card to help you do so. And I do think even without Histgrove being in the game, Thornhist Mage, you just play it in every Scout deck. It's a really good 5-cost card. It gets bigger over time, which can help you pressure. It's a really good wall against aggro decks. Even if you're not really utilizing the ramp to the full effect, and the ramp helps you get to your late game bombs, your late game stabilizing tools, just those really powerful plays that Scout has access to. So I do recommend, if you're going to play Scout at all, 3 Thornhist Mage is a good investment and one that you'll be happy you made in the future. Despite, even if you're playing mid-range, it's still a good beat stick, it's still a good wall, versatile card. Yeah, Thornhist Mage is just really good in Scout. And now we move on to the neutrals, and while the class-specific cards are typically higher, In power level, the neutral cards are typically a little bit lower because, again, you could use them in any single deck that you play. So if the power level was off the charts, you'd have a card that was essentially a staple across every single deck you'd ever see. So I don't think we need to talk too much in particular about any of these. In fact, I'm just going to go through them, whereas the last one we went through because all the dual attribute cards were really good. There's nothing here that really screams you must craft. The title of the video is Necessary Epics, and none of these are necessary at all. So I'll just go through epic by epic and talk about them. Flesh Sculpture, nothing more than a meme card from the Fall of the Dark Brotherhood. You should not play this card in Constructed. If you're playing this card, it tells me that you think your deck is not good, does not have good card quality, so you're just trying to randomly sack your way into better cards. But yeah, not worth it. Very fun RNG card, though, if that's what you're into, I guess. Heroic Rebirth, kind of the same vein, except it is better than Flesh Sculpture, because at least the RNG is limited to unique legendary creatures. Heroic Rebirth, however, is, again, too slow. You can just include better finishes in your deck. I tried it when it came out. It's very good in Arena, because it can give you more threat density when you don't really have control over your deck building. You have to just take what the game gives you in Arena. In Constructed, there are just better options, and again, getting your supports destroyed by support removal does not feel great, and this is a high-value support to have destroyed. Mechanical Ally. Alright, so this is, we're going to talk about all the Dwemmers together, I think. I think I have to talk about Halls of the Dwemer first. I don't know how one is supposed to rate Dwemmers. As of right now, they're not good. And a lot of it's because Halls of the Dwemer is one of the only reasons to play it, and it is a support that is easily removed, like I mentioned, and very slow. If Dwemmers ever gets good, Hall gets good. As of right now, the Halls of the Dwemer, the Dwarven Centurion, the Stronghold Incubator, these are all just sort of meme cards, because the Dwemer just aren't very good, period. Like, there's just not a whole lot of incentive to play them. We're all waiting, maybe one day. And Mechanical Ally is objectively one of the better cards in the deck. Getting a free Spider Worker if the top card of your deck is neutral is really powerful. If you can get this card to proc consistently, the card is good. The issue with that is, if you can get this card to proc consistently, your deck is full of neutrals, and therefore has a lower power level than the average deck, which is a significant problem when there's not a whole lot of incentive to pack your deck full of neutrals. The best we have is Halls of the Dwemer, basically. But yeah, in the Dwemer deck, this card is required. In a Dwemer deck, this card is required. Dwemmers just aren't part of the meta currently, maybe one day. Stronghold Eradicator I didn't mention with Dwemmers because it actually sees some play outside of Dwemmers as a reasonable 5-drop. Some Monk decks, some Assassin decks have used it before. Not required for any of these decks, however, I wouldn't put it on a necessary legendary, or less necessary epic crafting guide as a necessary epic. But it is reasonable if you have a copy of this card and you're missing some other cards. This is a beat stick, and it has some added utility by giving cards in the Shadow Lane guard, so you can use your lethals or just your regular creatures to trade into things that wouldn't actually be targets for attacks, since they did have cover at the time. But yeah, pretty good. 5-drop 6/6 is just a pretty good card. Not required for anything, though. Well, Dwemmers. Dwemmers, you really want that card. Forsaken Champion, Madhouse Collection, it's horrible. You never want this card. There's no deck where this effect is actually worth it. Ignore it. And not a pull to buy Madhouse Collection, obviously. If you have Madhouse Collection for other cards, Armaments, good in Arena sometimes, not good in Constructed, better items out there. Illusory Mimic, pretty decent card in the deck built around it. There's Mimic Archers, some Mimic Monks. Those decks aren't really the best way to play their class ever. I don't think they've ever been top tier, but they have sometimes been pretty good in Constructed. I wouldn't worry about getting Madhouse just for this card unless you really want to play that style of deck. But it's a card that does kind of require you to build a deck around it, which is sometimes unfortunate because a lot of the keyword heavy cards aren't very good. But unlike Battle Reef of Dusk, this card is actually a pretty good pull to play keyword cards, and when it goes off for a lot of effect, it's very good. The issue is it's, variance heavy. Depending on how much you pack your deck, you still have to rely on the top of your deck having some of those keywords, and if you don't, then this card is obviously just completely trash. 6-drop 5/5 by itself, not Constructed playable in the least, but the chance of building your deck around it and getting, like, Charge, Drain, Ward at the same time, that's pretty crazy. That is pretty crazy. And Dwarven Centurion, as I mentioned, good beat stick in Arena, good Dwemer card, but Dwemmers aren't very good, so I wouldn't worry about it. And that is it, guys. We've successfully made it through in this video 2 colors, the dual colors, and the neutral cards, and we've gone over through part 1 and part 2, every epic in the game. There's been a lot of work, but it's been a lot of fun to really analyze the cards like this as well. Hopefully this helped you out if you're a new player building your collection, gives you an idea of some of the most played legendaries and epics if you watch the legendary video too. Gives you an idea of maybe your priorities that you should pick up first, and some playable ones that you see in a good amount of decks, but maybe aren't super required right off the bat. If this did help, feel free to leave a like. Do consider subscribing to the channel, helps me out a lot. You'll be notified when all the new videos come out. I do daily videos for Legends, crafting guides like this sometimes, gameplay videos, deck techs, other strategy content mostly. Hopefully you enjoy the content. Subscribing is one of the best ways to stay up to date with the content. Also follow my stream in the description down below to catch me live, and I'll see you guys next time.